The fog rolled in off Puget Sound before sunrise, the way it always did in November, pressing low against the rooftops of Seattle and turning the streetlights into soft, blurred halos. Inside the small waterfront cafe on 2nd Avenue, the espresso machine hissed steadily, and the smell of dark roast hung thick in the air. I sat at a table near the window, both hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't actually sipped from in 20 minutes. Outside, the early commuters moved past in their coats and scarves, heads down, breath clouding. I watched them without really seeing them. I had been rehearsing what I was going to say for 3 days. Daniel was late, which wasn't unusual. He was always running behind on Monday mornings, always apologizing with that easy half-smile that made me forgive him before he even finished the sentence. I had loved that smile once. I still did, if I was being honest with myself, which I was trying very hard not to be. The test I had taken Thursday morning was still sitting in the back of my mind like a stone I couldn't put down. Positive. 6 weeks along. I had taken 2 more after the first one, standing in the bathroom of my apartment at 7 in the morning while the radiator knocked and hissed. All 3 said the same thing. I had sat on the edge of the tub for a long time afterward, not crying, not smiling, just sitting there with the strange, floating feeling of a person who has just watched the floor shift beneath their feet. Daniel arrived 11 minutes late, unwinding his scarf as he came through the door. He spotted me, lifted a hand, and made his way over. He looked tired. He'd looked tired for weeks. Actually, the kind of tired that came from long hours, and too much ambition, and a mind that never quite switched off. He was a hospital administrator, good at his job, better at wanting more from it. That drive was one of the things I had admired about him when we first met 18 months ago in the break room of Harborview Medical Center, where I worked as a registered nurse on the cardiac floor. He had come in to introduce himself to the department heads. I had come in to get coffee. We'd talked for 40 minutes without either of us noticing. "Hey," he said, dropping into the chair across from me. He reached over and squeezed my hand briefly. "Sorry, the morning was a mess. How are you?" "I'm okay." I smiled at him because it was easier than the truth. "How are you?" He exhaled, leaning back. "I actually have something I need to talk to you about. Something pretty big." He glanced around the cafe, then back at me. "I was going to call you last night, but I figured this was better in person." Something in his tone made me set my mug down. He told me he'd been offered a position. Chief Operations Officer at a hospital network in Boston, a role he'd been quietly pursuing for the better part of a year without mentioning it to me. His voice was careful, measured, the way he spoke in meetings when he already knew the outcome and was simply managing delivery. "It's the right move for my career," he said. "You know that's been the goal." "Boston," I repeated. "I know it's a lot." He folded his hands on the table. "I've been thinking about how to say this for a while. The thing is, Lily, we've had something good here. I really believe that. But I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I don't think what we have is built for this kind of distance. I think we both know it." The cafe felt very quiet suddenly, even though nothing had changed. The espresso machine still hissed. The door still opened and closed. "Are you breaking up with me?" I said. It wasn't really a question. He looked at me with an expression I could only describe as relieved apology, like a man who had prepared for a storm and was grateful to find only still air. "I think it's the honest thing to do. I care about you. I don't want to drag this out across 2 time zones and hurt you more in the end." My hands were very still on the table. The thing I had been rehearsing for 3 days pressed hard at the back of my throat, and I thought for one clear second that I would say it anyway, that I would tell him right then. Just let the words fall out into the space between us and see what happened. But I looked at his face the way he was already leaning back slightly, already retreating, and I understood that he had made his decision before he sat down. The conversation was a formality. I said nothing about the 3 tests in my bathroom drawer. "Okay," I said instead, quietly. He blinked. He had expected more, I think. Tears or anger, or at least argument. When none came, He looked almost unsettled. He said something about hoping I understood, about being grateful for the time we'd had, about knowing I'd be fine because I was one of the strongest people he knew. The words washed past me without landing. He left a few minutes later with his scarf loose around his shoulders and a look of faint relief on his face. I watched him through the window as he walked up 2nd Avenue and disappeared into the fog. Then I put my hand flat on the table, stared at it, and breathed. I drove to my mother's house in Bellevue that evening. She was in the kitchen when I let myself in, reheating something on the stove, her phone propped against the fruit bowl playing the news at low volume. My stepfather's golf clubs were visible through the sliding door to the garage. She looked up when I came in, reading my face the way mothers do. "What happened?" she said. I told her about Daniel first. She made a sympathetic sound and said she had never been entirely sure about him, which I knew wasn't true but didn't bother correcting. Then I told her the rest. She turned the stove burner off. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very carefully, "How far along?" 6 weeks. Another silence. She picked up her phone, turned off the news. "Lily." Her voice had shifted into something I recognized the tone she used when she thought she was being practical. "You're 26. You're still building your career. You just made charge nurse. This isn't the right time. I know the timing isn't ideal." "It's not about ideal." She looked at me steadily. "You're alone. He's leaving. You'd be doing this completely by yourself. People do it by themselves. People struggle," she said firmly, like that settled it. "You have worked so hard to get where you are. I just don't want to see you throw that away because of a situation you didn't plan for." I looked at the fruit bowl. There was one orange sitting in it, slightly soft on one side. I focused on that for a moment. "I haven't decided anything yet," I said. My stepfather's car pulled into the driveway then, the headlights sweeping across the kitchen wall. My mother glanced toward the garage and then back at me, and I could see her recalibrating, folding the conversation away for later. "We'll talk more this weekend," she said, already moving to the cabinet for a third plate. We didn't talk more that weekend. I didn't bring it up again, and she didn't either, and by Monday morning I had understood something I didn't particularly want to understand. I was going to do this without her, too. My Aunt Ruth lived 4 hours south in a town called Astoria, right where the Columbia River opened into the Pacific. I had spent summers there as a child while my mother worked long hours in the city. Ruth was my father's sister, technically my aunt by blood even after my father passed when I was 9, and my mother had never quite known what to do with her, but had been grateful enough for the free childcare to keep the relationship. Ruth was a retired maritime nurse who had lived alone for 20 years since her husband died, in a shingled house on a hill above the harbor. She kept a garden that was mostly windswept and stubborn, like her, and she made the best clam chowder on the Oregon coast, which she would tell you herself if you gave her the opportunity. I called her on a Tuesday night. I told her everything in one long, unbroken run of words, the kind you save up for the person you trust most. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a pause, and then she said, "Well, when are you coming?" "I don't want to impose." "Lily Ann Harmon," she said, using my full name the way she only did when I was being particularly foolish. "Get in the car." I put in for a leave of absence at the hospital on Friday. I packed 2 bags and my nursing certification binders and my grandmother's quilt, which I had kept folded at the top of my closet since I moved into my apartment. I drove south on I-5 with the radio low and the November sky pressing flat and gray over the highway, and somewhere around Kelso I started crying and didn't stop until I crossed the Astoria Bridge and saw the river, wide and silver below me, and felt something in my chest unknot by a small but perceptible degree. Ruth was waiting at the end of her driveway in a rain jacket, her gray hair pulled back, her arms already open. The house smelled like wood smoke and the sea. She fed me chowder at the kitchen table and asked exactly the questions I needed her to ask, and none of the ones I didn't. She showed me the spare room, which had a window looking out toward the harbor and a patchwork rug on the floor, that I remembered from summers long past. She had put fresh towels on the bed and a small lamp on the nightstand and a paperback she thought I might like. That night, lying in the narrow bed with the sound of wind off the water outside, I pressed both hands to my stomach and said quietly, to no one and to someone, "We're going to be all right." I don't know exactly how yet, but we are. I almost believed it. My daughter was born in late June, in the small hospital 12 miles from Astoria, on a morning when the fog had burned off early and the harbor was lit up gold by 7 a.m. Ruth sat beside me through all of it, steady and calm, squeezing my hand during contractions and telling me with absolute authority that I was doing fine. She had delivered babies as a nurse. She had seen harder things than this. Her certainty was its own kind of medicine. When they placed my daughter in my arms, I was not prepared for how completely the world rearranged itself. She was small and warm and furious, her face scrunched with the indignity of existence, her fingers already curled tight like she was holding on to something. I looked at her for a long time without speaking. Sophie, I thought. Yes. Sophie Ruth Harmon. The middle name wasn't a question. The first months were survival in its simplest form. Feeding and sleeping and not sleeping, and the particular exhaustion that sits behind your eyes like sand. Ruth moved through it all with the efficiency of someone who had seen hard things and learned not to be frightened by them. She took Sophie in the early mornings so I could sleep 2 unbroken hours. She left meals in the refrigerator labeled with masking tape and a marker. She never once made me feel like a burden. Even when I cried in the bathroom at midnight because I was so tired, I had forgotten what it felt like not to be tired. I began studying again when Sophie was 3 months old. Ruth would settle her in the old wooden rocker by the window, and I would sit at the kitchen table with my materials spread out around me, working toward my certification as a family nurse practitioner. It was slower than I had planned. Everything was slower than I had planned. But Ruth would look up from whatever she was doing sometimes and say, with complete conviction, 1 page at a time, "That's still forward." I passed my boards 14 months after Sophie was born on a Tuesday afternoon in March, sitting at a testing center in Portland while Ruth drove Sophie around Astoria in the old pickup truck until the result came through. I called her from the parking lot afterward. "Well," she said, "I passed." There was a sound I had never heard from Ruth before, something between a laugh and a sob, and then she said, "I'm putting the good wine out tonight." The clinic in Astoria had an opening for a nurse practitioner. I applied, thinking it was a long shot. They hired me within the week. The work was different from hospital nursing, slower in some ways, more intimate in others. I saw the same patients across years. I knew their names and their families and their histories. I knew who was managing their diabetes well and who wasn't. I knew which teenagers were struggling and which elderly patients were lonely. The work fit me in a way I hadn't expected, like a coat that turned out to be exactly the right weight. I found a small rental house 3 blocks from Ruth's, pale blue with a front porch and a yard that was more ambition than reality. Sophie learned to walk in that yard on a September afternoon, listing dramatically from the porch steps to the patch of grass, laughing every time she fell down. I sat on the bottom step and watched her, and felt something so large it didn't have a name. She had my stubbornness, and Ruth's eyes, and a laugh that seemed to come from somewhere I couldn't identify, warm and unself-conscious, a laugh that made other people turn and smile without knowing why. She called Ruth Ruthie and followed her everywhere. Life was not without its lonely hours. There were evenings when Sophie was asleep and the house was quiet, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and felt the particular ache of doing something hard without a partner to share it with. I did not think about Daniel often, and when I did it was without much feeling, the way you think about a road you didn't take, not with regret exactly, just with the mild, distant acknowledgement that things had gone differently than you once expected. I had made a life. It was a good one. It was mine. It was a Saturday morning in May. Sophie, not quite 2, when the harbor master asked Ruth if she knew anyone who could manage some light electrical work on the dock office. Ruth, who knew everyone in Astoria, said she'd ask around. What she actually did was mention it to her neighbor, who mentioned it to the man who worked out of the old boat shed on Pier 11. His name was Marcus Webb. He had come to Astoria 5 years before from Missoula, following a contract to restore a historic wooden schooner, and had stayed because the work kept coming and the town suited him. He was a marine carpenter, boats mostly, but also the old Victorian houses that lined the hills above the harbor, the ones with complicated trim that required someone who understood how wood moved. He was quiet in a way that wasn't unfriendly, just self-contained, the kind of person who listens more than he speaks and means it when he does. He came to fix the dock office wiring on a Saturday. Ruth was there because she was always at the harbor on Saturdays, keeping an eye on things in a general way that no one had assigned to her. Sophie was with me, toddling around the dock in her yellow rain boots, dangerously interested in the gap between the boards. He noticed her first, actually. She had gotten close to the edge, and he stepped over without a word, simply placing himself between her and the water, crouching down to her level. "There's fish down there," he said. "You want to see one, you'd have to stand back a little. They come closer when it's quieter." Sophie stared at him with the frank suspicion of a toddler encountering a new adult. Then she stepped back. Then she looked at the water. "Fish," she said. "Yep." She seemed to accept this. She moved back toward me and pressed her face against my leg, still watching him sideways. I thanked him. He said it was fine. We had a conversation that lasted approximately 4 minutes about the dock and the weather and whether the herring were running, and then he went inside to look at the wiring. Ruth appeared at my elbow the moment he was gone, wearing an expression I recognized. "Don't," I said. "I didn't say a word," she said. He came back the following Saturday for a different job on the dock, and Sophie, who remembered things with startling precision for a person her size, pointed at him and said "Fishman" with great confidence. He crouched down again, patient and unhurried, and showed her a crab he'd found in one of the dock traps. By the time we left that morning, she had named the crab Gerald and was already asking when we were coming back. He started appearing in the small, natural way that people do in small towns, at the farmer's market, at the coffee counter at the bakery on Marine Drive, at the community bonfire on the 4th of July, where Sophie fell asleep in my arms before the fireworks finished, and he carried his jacket over and set it across her without being asked. We talked for an hour by the fire while she slept. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He did not perform interest, he was simply interested. I was slow to trust it. My history had made me careful with the part of myself that wanted things, and I moved cautiously, like a person testing ice. He never pushed. He showed up in the same quiet, consistent way, regardless of whether I was warm or guarded, and somewhere, in the steadiness of that, the wariness in me gradually lost its grip. He met me for coffee one morning without Sophie, which we had not done before, and at the end of it he said simply, "I'd like to spend more time with you, if that's something you'd want." I looked at him for a moment. "I have a daughter," I said. "I know. She's my first priority. That doesn't change." "I wouldn't expect it to," he said. He said it the way he said everything, without decoration, without the practiced sincerity that people sometimes put on like a coat. He just said it, and I believed him. "Okay," I said. He smiled then, a slow, quiet smile that reached his eyes. Seasons moved. Sophie called him by his name at first, then gradually, on her own timeline, began calling him Marcus at our house, which made Ruth laugh until her eyes watered and which eventually shortened, by Sophie's own logic, to just Marcus. He repaired the rotting porch steps at the blue house without being asked, showing up on a Saturday with lumber in the truck bed, and Sophie immediately attached to his side, wanting to hold every tool in order of size. He taught her how to sand with the grain. He was patient in a way that didn't look like effort. On a Tuesday evening in October, 3 years after that first morning on the dock, he sat across from me at the kitchen table after Sophie was in bed, and said he had something he wanted to ask me. He had a small box. He did not make a speech. What he said was, "I'm not trying to change what you've built. I just want to be part of it. You and Sophie both." I didn't answer right away. I sat with it for a moment, feeling the weight of the question and also its rightness, the way a thing can be both significant and simple at the same time. "Yes," I said. "We were married in April at the harbor, on a clear morning, with the river glittering below us, and Ruth crying openly in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she had borrowed from the harbor master. Sophie stood between us during the ceremony in a white dress she had chosen herself, holding the rings in a small velvet pouch, her face arranged in an expression of tremendous responsibility. When it was over, she tugged Marcus's hand and said, "Now you live with us all the time," and he said, "That's the idea," and she said, "Good," with the finality of a person who had thought it through. Sophie was 6 when our clinic partnered with a children's hospital in Portland for a pediatric outreach program. Once a month, I drove up for the day to consult on cases and attend a joint session with the hospital's family medicine team. It was a long day, and I usually took the train when I could, which left me free to review notes on the ride back without worrying about traffic. On a Friday in September, I was standing on the platform at Portland Union Station with my bag over my shoulder and my lanyard still around my neck, watching my students. I supervised 2 nursing students who attended the Outreach Days file through the turnstile. The platform was busy, the afternoon trains south filling quickly with commuters and weekend travelers. I heard his voice before I saw him. It was on a phone call, close enough that it carried over the platform noise, sharp, defensive, the tone of a man losing an argument he knew he had caused. I turned slightly, and there he was, maybe 15 feet away, standing just off the main stream of foot traffic, his free hand pressed to his forehead. Daniel. He looked older, which I registered neutrally, the way you register the weather. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid. Whatever the conversation was, it wasn't going well. I caught pieces of it, something about a missed appointment, something about always being like this, and then his voice rose, and I stopped listening because it wasn't my business. The strange thing was how completely unremarkable it felt. I had thought, in the abstract, about what it might be like to see him again. I had imagined, in early years, that it might sting, or that I might want to say something, or that I might feel some complicated storm, a feeling that I would have to stand in and survive. Instead, I felt almost nothing. A faint recognition, the way you might recognize a street in a city you used to live in. Oh yes, that's where that was, and then simply moved on. My students were waiting. I was adjusting the strap of my bag and turning toward the gate when he looked up from his phone and saw me. Recognition crossed his face. He lowered the phone. "Lily," he said. I stopped, looked at him. He moved a step or two toward me, the call apparently ended or abandoned. His expression had the quality of a man who had prepared things to say and was now scrambling to find them. "Hey, wow." I can't believe he looked me over in the way that is supposed to convey pleasant surprise, and instead conveys assessment. "You look great. What are you doing in Portland?" "Work," I said. "Right, you're still in nursing? Are you up here now, or—" "No," I kept my voice even. "Still on the coast." He nodded, processing. Then, "I'm in Portland now. I've been here about a year, actually. Health system on the east side." He said the name of it with a small, practiced emphasis, the way he had always mentioned things he wanted credit for. "It's been a good move." "That's good," I said. A pause. He glanced down, and then back up. "I've thought about you, actually. I've wondered how you were doing." I didn't respond to that directly. Something had shifted in me since the moment I saw him, not hostility, nothing so animated as that. Simply a very clear awareness of exactly how little this mattered to me now. The platform was moving around us, people flowing past in both directions, and I was standing in the middle of it, perfectly still, perfectly steady, and feeling nothing sharper than mild acknowledgement. "I should go," I said. My train's boarding. He opened his mouth. I could see him reaching for something, some note that might hold me a beat longer, and it was exactly in that moment that I heard Sophie behind me. She had come through the turnstile with Marcus, who had driven up to meet me and collect the car, and she was already moving fast in the way she always moved, purposeful, her braids bouncing, her backpack slapping her shoulders, and she came directly to my side and took my hand with the authority of a person who knows exactly where she belongs. Mom. She tugged once, looking up. Marcus says if we catch the 4:15, we can stop at the harbor for chips on the way home. Can we? We can, I said, and I squeezed her hand. Marcus was there a step behind her, one hand on her shoulder now, looking at me with a question in his eyes. You okay? That I answered with a small nod. He glanced at Daniel briefly. Not rudely, not with any performance. Just the calm, unhurried look of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. I looked at Daniel then, one last time, and saw it the understanding moving across his face. His gaze dropped to Sophie, taking in the braids and the height and the certain angle of her jaw, and then it moved to Marcus, easy and grounded beside her, and then came back to me. Something shifted in his expression that I did not stop to interpret. This is my family, I said, quietly, simply, not as a declaration, but just as the plainest accurate thing I could say. It was good to see you. I turned. Sophie was already pulling toward the platform, her voice rising as she told Marcus about the crane she had seen through the station window and whether it was bigger than the one at the Astoria Pier. Marcus answered her with the seriousness she expected and deserved. I fell into step beside them, adjusting my bag, and we moved through the gate without looking back. On the train, Sophie claimed the window seat with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this since the parking garage, and Marcus sat beside her, and I sat across from them, and the train began to move. The city slid past in evening light, the platform pulling away. Sophie pressed her nose to the glass. I can see the river from here, she announced. That's the Willamette, Marcus said. Is it the same river as ours? Different river, same general idea. She considered this. I like ours better. Me too. I looked out the window. The platform was behind us now, entirely out of sight, as though it had never existed. I felt the particular quiet that comes after a thing you had been, without fully knowing it, bracing for a quiet that was actually relief, expansive and clean. I thought about the morning in the cafe in Seattle with the fog outside and the lukewarm coffee and the thing I hadn't said. I thought about the drive south on I-5 November, crying somewhere around Kelso. I thought about Ruth at the end of her driveway in the rain jacket. I thought about Sophie, all of 6 pounds and furious, on the morning the harbor was lit up gold. What I did not feel was regret. Not for the choice I'd made, not for the words I'd swallowed in that cafe, not for any of it. The path I had taken had not been the one I planned, but it had led me here, to this seat, on this train, with these two people, and here was exactly right. Sophie fell asleep somewhere south of Wilsonville, her head tipping against Marcus's arm. He didn't move, just rested his chin lightly on top of her head, and looked out the window at the darkening fields. He caught my eye across the aisle and smiled the quiet smile I had come to know as well as my own reflection. Outside, the Oregon hills rolled past in the last light, and the Columbia was out there, somewhere to the west, widening toward the sea, and at the end of the line there was a pale blue house with a porch that had solid new steps and a yard with ambitions, and a neighbor who would have the light on. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. The past had had its chance. It had nothing left to offer me. What I had now was the present full and ordinary and irreplaceable, and it was more than enough.